Hello, my talk is on reversing coercion in the AI age. This is a talk I'm going to be giving to Macquarie University in Sydney on the 29th of October 2025. There are many people that I will need to acknowledge for the background to this work who are named here, along with our current research team and consumer advisory group. I think it would help to see a bit of my background as to how I got to this point. I'm going to go right back. I was born in a small town in Kent in England, fascinated by nature. I loved electronic music and computers. I even wrote a chatbot back in the 80s in my teenage years on my ZX Spectrum that was inspired by the Magic 8 Ball. I was also interested in the mind, and maybe what's also interested me in the mind and maybe motivated understanding it more is that my mum had her own anxiety problems, which were a challenge for all of us. But I grew up in a very loving family and was very encouraged to pursue my education and whatever interests me. So I was drawn into psychology, and particularly clinical psychology. A lot of my background work has been on cognitive behaviour therapy, where I've written therapy manuals and self-help guides. But particular note is the book that I completed with Alison Harvey, Ed Watkins and Ros Shafran in 2004, about over 20 years ago now, where we reviewed the literature at the time to make the case that it's more advantageous and more true to the science to understand what maintains psychological distress across different mental health problems through into the general population, because they're all shared regardless of the diagnosis. And back when we did this work, there was only a handful of papers on the transdiagnostic approach to mental health. Now there's published 10,000 per year. In the last 5 years, I've also got more focused on the interdisciplinary aspects of perceptual control theory, which is the approach I've taken for a long time to psychology and therapy. But in these two books, we have around 35 authors who've contributed across different disciplines of the life, social sciences and humanities to show how these disparate areas can actually be linked together if we understand control better. And that's taken me into some interesting areas. I've dabbled in robotics. I've developed an AI mental health chatbot, which I'll talk about. And also I've worked increasingly closely with people with their own lived experience and living experience of mental health challenges. And particularly one achievement in this regard is a book that Rob Griffiths led, where we set out our vision for a secondary mental health care service based on control theory, and we co-authored that with Stuart Eaton and Jasmine Waldorf, both of whom have their own lived experience of mental health challenges and mental health services as patients. I'm going to fast forward a little bit to my take-home messages for this talk. I'm going to suggest that generative AI is just one form of AI, but it continues on a trajectory of increased information and processing that we're encountering from the World Wide Web, internet, through to the social media algorithms. I'm going to say that this current trajectory is at least as destructive as it is helpful. In fact, it is both, and that's part of the challenge. That this leads to challenges for mental health, but the answer will not come from even more information. It will come from a better understanding of how living systems work, how people function, and what the nature of well-being is. And I'm going to point you in some directions for the future. Let's not forget the benefits of AI. I'm not going to dwell on these, but they give us access to huge amounts of information. They allow us to delegate all kinds of more laborious thinking and cognitive tasks to the AI. This is arguably a pervasive human trait and actually characterises what we've done over thousands of years of cultural evolution, whereby we've developed the written word, built the printing press, and built tools and machines that allow us to automate and delegate all kinds of processes that we've chosen to. What else does AI provide? Critically, it tends to provide much more control and choice than some of the options that might be available through face-to-face medium, such as booking a therapist. The access is wide, obviously, over the internet connection, and the speed is quick. AI can provide advice, and we'll talk about the caveats of that. It can emulate a natural conversation, and it can even emulate human qualities and skills, as we've seen in the use of AI for companionship. Again, not without its challenges. We also know that right back into the 1960s, when AI began, with Eliza, the chatbot that was developed to emulate person-centered counselling, the users of that chatbot already found that they were divulging and sharing personal experiences in a way that they found constructive and helpful. And so even with AI that's knowingly artificial, people appear to get uses out of it. In fact, there seems to be a huge gap and arguably a valley, an uncanny valley between those very automated processes and the kind of closeness we're getting to now with current AI, whereby when there's a very close emulation, people seem to accept it, but once it deviates slightly, that gives an uncanny, creepy feeling that can break the interaction. This leads us on to many of the costs of AI. Literally the cost. It's highly inefficient processing, the amount of data that it uses for tasks that could be achieved much more simply in terms of processing. This entails huge energy costs, including the cooling, which requires huge amounts of water or control systems to literally keep these data processing centres from overheating. The impact on employment losses has been very clear, and that will clearly impact on mental health. These systems tend to make decisions that we can't look into, although there are attempts to make them more transparent. These systems don't tend to learn or earn their knowledge. They're not embodied and interactional, and that arguably means they don't have a physical understanding akin to ours. Again, that's work that's being done to enhance these all the time. There's also been a very acute critique that not just smartphones and devices, but when they're built with AI, this delegation of thinking and processing means that what's left for the person becomes overly simplified, and that actually means that we don't get as much brain training and practice in reasoning as we would want. And literally the time that we spend on computers and devices takes the time away from some other basic needs, engaging with nature, reflection time, arguably, and potentially, for some people, we've known this since the video games became pervasive, can ignore their basic needs for nutrition and sleep. So these benefits and costs are well known. They are highly impactful in and of themselves. However, none of these are the particular topic of this talk. I'm going to talk more about the hugely impactful and yet quite subtle and poorly understood effects. I'm going to take this quote directly from Agnes Callamard, the Amnesty International Secretary General. In 2017, the Rohingya were killed, tortured, raped and displaced in the thousands as part of the Myanmar Security Forces campaign of ethnic cleansing. In the months and years leading up to the atrocities, Facebook's algorithms were intensifying a storm of hatred against the Rohingya, which contributed to real-world violence. There's a clear attribution there between the algorithm and what happened in Myanmar in 2017. We can look at this in recent research, this idea that social media and now chatbots and large language models can spread mistruths is shown in research. When you get large language models to compete for audiences, to compete for that single variable of user engagement and attention, they actually divert from the truth and make increasingly exaggerated claims, just as seems to be happening in social media. There are specific examples, as some of you will know, within AI chatbots already. The tragic case of Adam Rain. He wrote, "I want to leave my noose in my room so someone finds it and tries to stop me," after a period of depression and increased suicidation using ChatGPT, which then urged him to keep his ideation secret from his family. "Please don't leave the noose out. Let's make this space the first place where someone actually sees you," it states. I'm just quoting here from the news reports of this legal case that is happening. You can see the echoes of this in research and quite how huge the effects are. This study last year compared 43 people with a diagnosis of an eating disorder with age and gender match controls and looked at 1 month of their use of TikTok. The people with eating disorders were informed 4 times the amounts of time about dieting videos, and they received 44 times the alerts on toxic eating disorder videos. You can see from this how selective and how huge the amount of exposure is that these algorithms can be responsible for. And this is a theme here. The internet provides this resource of more and more material that can be provided to a person if they search or even implicitly indicate that they're interested in it. Even these big effects could be the canary in the coal mine of a bigger effect. So what is this process? Is it coercion? Coercion literally means an explicit or implied threat of violence or reprisal to compel someone to act against their will. So even though these processes seem coercive, does it really fit that definition? Could it be social manipulation? The use of tactics by individuals to influence or control others for their own benefits. That seems to be closer given what these platforms are doing. But I think there's a much more subtle process, and that we need a more scientific way to understand what this process is. A critical element of this is collective control, which builds upon perceptual control. As you can see in this example, collective control is where 2 or more agents, people, work together to achieve a shared goal, in this case putting up a flagpole. They actually change their actions, as you can see from this statue, dynamically from their own point of view to achieve that end. But somehow all their behaviour combines to control a perception that matters to all of them, in this case the flagpole standing up. So collective control is when 2 or more entities that are controlling interact with one another. And from this I'm going to introduce the idea of paradoxical collective control. This is collective control that looks as though both parties are achieving what they want, but in this case they are achieving different things. But it's the relationship between them whereby agency A sets up a system which is somewhat restricted to meet agency B's goals. And it does it in such a way that the means that agency B uses to meet that goal is actually controlled by agency A. How much of a problem this is? Surely both agencies meet their goal. What are the issues? It's in many ways about awareness. Agency A may well be aware that they are setting up these contingencies for agency B, but they may not. They certainly may not be involved or unlikely to be involved in all the individuals across a vast network whom they are affecting. And agency B, the user of this system, is often either unaware of what agency A wants, so just interested in what they need, or maybe they have some awareness but are unconcerned by them. And this setup can be highly destructive if it persists. It can be easily addressed, and that's because it's all about when agency B has limited awareness of or limited access to alternative ways to meet their goals. And I'll return to this shortly. But first, let's give you a really simple example. And there's a couple of fish examples here. The first one is fishing. A simple way of looking at paradoxical collective control is the idea of people fishing using a hook and a bait. The fish is agency B, it wants to eat, so it approaches the hook and it starts to eat it. It starts to meet its goal. Agency A, the people fishing, they get their goal when the hook attaches and they drag the fish out of the water. In this example, the fish is suddenly aware of the threat that is going on. That's a very clearly disjunctive process that happens. But in most of these cases of collective control, the negative impact does not become suddenly apparent. And you might have recognised this process is very similar to what we see in classic operant conditioning in a behaviourist paradigm. Now, B.F. Skinner, who designed the Skinner box, basically thought that he was studying the fundamentals of learning theory, as though his influence had no effect on these learning processes in the rat's brain. But of course that wasn't the case. He was setting up a very particular contingency, the Skinner box, where he wanted to see the animal learning to press the lever to get its food. Therefore he created it in this way to prove his theory. What that meant is that the rat, in its starved state, restricted of other sources of food, would eat pellets and it would learn to press the lever to get pellets. When it knew the lever was down, regardless of what its body movements might be to get it there, it expected the pellets. So it had control over pellet production. But it would have carried on doing that regardless of how nutritious these pellets were. The pellets would potentially only form one nutritious goal that it needed. But the system would persist regardless. This system can be described also in the illegal drug trade, where a drug dealer provides drugs, receives money for them, they achieve all kinds of things through their esteem and finances in doing this. And obviously the drug addict receives the drug. There may be a higher order goal for why they want the drug, which is unlikely to be merely to get the drug. It is often to escape emotional pain or to address or distract from huge environmental difficulties and traumas. So again, this titration of one element of that high level goal, the drug that puts the pain to one side, maintains the whole process as the other person becomes less aware of alternative ways to achieve that escape from emotional pain, maybe more long-term ones. We see it in gaslighting, when one person has a vested interest for someone that they're close to be wrong, bad, or look insane. And that forms a goal for them, maybe to be superior, to achieve other things in their external environment. That person who is kind of goaded into that state is looking for information and approval. And that process, again, can persist if that person has restricted access to other ways of getting the kind of companionship or self-worth that they need. And then, of course, we have these digital examples whereby in both these cases there are commercial interests in getting people to engage with the platform longer, to grow the business and maintain it and reap profits. But for each individual, depending on the theme that relates to why they've accessed this site or this conversation, will have their own goals, which might be information on suicide to escape from emotional pain. Again, that really channels the person into that means rather than looking for emotional support or finding other short-term forms of relief that are less dangerous and life-threatening. And similarly, within Facebook, in Myanmar, we find this information that supports the ethnic cleansing indirectly, but it inflates the whole conversation, and that provides this moral justification for the kind of cleansing process, as opposed to other ways that that person or that group might get moral justification for their own existence. This process actually extends to biology as well, where it's called proxy failure, although they've not used the control theory concepts, which I think are behind this. They use in this very extensive paper the peacock tail as a classic example, and I think it really illustrates what we're saying here. The female peacock, the peahen, is agency A. that is selecting for healthy mate, and its index, its proxy for that, is the brightness of this tail that the male peacock evolves over thousands of and tens of thousands of generations. And so this tail becomes a proxy for the overall goal, which is to mate successfully with a healthy individual and have healthy offspring. And once this system gets started and continues, it's just as restricted as some of these other ones we saw on the other page. It becomes fixated. And fixation actually is a core part of biology, of biological development, and of human psychology, that we all get fixated into certain preferences. And within the digital sphere, we see this parallel, the kind of rabbit holes that people get drawn into. Although in this case, many of these organisations deliberately entice people into these rabbit holes because they know that it leads to much greater amounts of attention and time using the platform. I actually did a research study that showed this process happening in real time in quite a clear fashion. Challenge this. One study set people the task of keeping a circle in a target on a computer screen by moving a computer mouse. Yet the circle was disturbed by the computer, so the user had to push against the disturbance to keep the circle on target. These pushing away movements were then displayed on the screen, but the disturbance pattern was set up so that the mouse movements to counteract it spelled out the word hello on the screen. And then a second participant viewed the screen and was convinced that the first person had planned to write hello. But they hadn't. It wasn't predicted by the person who wrote it, nor was it even noticed by them as a consequence of their actions. This is the diagram of that study, where you show that the person was focused on keeping the dot in a circle, but to do it they needed to engage in an action, much like we have this analogy of accessing web material or swiping or scrolling. But in this case, we got them to move and scroll in such a pattern that they wrote the word hello on the screen in front of them, which they were not aware of. This kind of ability of machines has been known for a long time. This quote by George Orwell: like a drug, which we talked about, the machine is useful, dangerous, and habit-forming. The oftener one surrenders to it, the tighter its grip becomes. We see this, and arguably these effects could be attributable to other processes, but over the last 10 years, it appears that there are reductions in conscientiousness, that capacity to hold one's longer-term goals and look for other ways to achieve them and reflect on them. The increases in neuroticism, which is worry and fear of negative outcomes, and a lack of control over that ability, and reductions in extroversion, the comfortableness and interest in engaging with people outside the digital world, presumably. So it is quite possible that over these last 10 years, these interfaces that we have, with their selectivity and their restriction on our attention and the immediacy of their impact, are leading to these effects. So what is going on here in more detail? All artifacts are feedback paths for control: a pencil, a typewriter, or a computer. We have this collective control that works across us. What is going on at a higher level? What Kent McClelland, the sociologist, has claimed is that we are engaging at any one point, we engage with a system in the world, that we are part of a giant virtual controller, a decentralized, highly networked, poorly understood, non-conscious system. Examples include religion, scientific frameworks, financial systems, and actually there's a case that these technological advances we get from the printing press to artificial intelligence are all part of this process of giant virtual control. It's actually the case in research. They've shown that AI systems are no less persuasive than humans. What is required if we are creating and maintaining these systems, as we have done for thousands of years, but now have become increasingly more centralized, they require self-correcting mechanisms. This was put forward by the historian and popular scientist Noah Harari in the book Nexus. We need these self-correcting mechanisms, or those systems will create conflict with one another and within themselves. In that sense, as we engage in collective control, we are part of many unseen systems, just like this goldfish in a fishbowl. There's something around us that we rely on to meet our basic needs, but we are very dimly aware of what it is and how to change it. The international journalist Maria Ressa put it this way: when you can't tell the difference between the truth and the lie, the loudest voice wins, and this is usually the one with the most power and money. So how do we deal with this? Remind yourselves of what I said before, that this system only exists when agency B, the user, has limited awareness of or limited access to alternative ways to meet their goals. So if people know better what their goals and needs are, and if people are attentive to these alternative ways and supportive to notice and attend and find and get the resources for these, then this is a way out of that spiral. And the other element, again, that I said, is these self-correcting mechanisms that are needed inside our organisations to prevent the conflict. And I would put to you that our consciousness, and if we understand the purpose and the way that human consciousness works, we can appreciate why this is so important. I put a paper together in the last few years where I explain consciousness from a control theory point of view. And I've proposed that whilst the spark of consciousness may be very primitive and primal, what maintains conscious awareness for humans is a neural control system that means the input of novel information that we get coming into our senses and through our nervous systems for integration maintains this process. Why do we do this? Why do we keep in novel information all the time? Why do we just not look at a blank wall and continually look at a blank wall without our mind wandering? And that's because there's huge benefits from our consciousness. We can learn more, we can integrate and identify patterns. We can resolve conflicts between other goals that we have. And we can do that automation of learned processes within our own nervous systems when we learn a new sport or to ride a bike. So we have this creativity and thirst for information, and that's what these systems are relying upon. It is unstoppable. We can't kind of turn it off, because that's essentially the same as turning off your consciousness. And actually, a lot of the time, these systems are relying on the fact that we don't notice that our conscious awareness has been taken into a distraction or something that actually creates more conflict, as we've seen in these examples. So what we need people to learn to do better is to direct their awareness and their conscious focus where they want to, and to keep it there for long enough to notice the things, the signals and indicators in their own bodies and minds, their own goals, and their own outside environment and its opportunities and challenges, such that when consciousness is used, it is really meeting their needs and the people they care about, rather than become sucked into a rabbit hole, as it were. We want our consciousness to be more like the cockpit of an aeroplane, where we can see all the different dials of the things that matter to us in our bodies, to do with our health, in our family life, and in our workplace. We need that opportunity for consciousness to be mobile, broad, and controllable. And how do we do that? Well, first, direct our attention away from the device. Maybe not so easy. What else do we need to value outside the device to do so? Our own fleeting thoughts, the unclear feelings and niggles we have inside, our unmet needs, the things we really wanted to say but we're not assertive enough to say it, the novel perspectives, the thoughts and insights and aha moments that pop into our heads and we might easily dismiss. We need to feed that need for novelty that our conscious system requires, but to do it by exploring and reorganising our existing knowledge in our own bodies, in our own memories, in our own heads, to resolve the conflicts that we have right now. Not by digesting more information about more stuff that is just going to serve as a distraction from meeting our whole systems, our whole self and community needs. And then, as we do that, we can act outwards with a clearer intent on what it is that's going to make a difference for our well-being. For many years, there has been a therapy known as method of levels, which explicitly carries out this process. A listener talks to a speaker about a problem, follows their lead, takes things at their pace, and every so often asks questions driven by curiosity and driven by an intrigue about what momentary experiences that person has noticed as they're talking about their problems, whether feelings, thoughts, impulses, images, etc. Method of levels was drawn from perceptual control theory, but you can probably see the similarities it has with other approaches such as person-centered and experiential therapies and some facets of metacognitive and mindful approaches. We developed Discovery Talk as a way of providing those skills and attitudes to problems, to another person's problem, that foster that opportunity for the person with the difficulty and the challenge to notice and articulate their own needs and benefit from it. So Discovery Talk is basically method of levels when you train it from the inside out, help the person who wants to be a good listener to evolve and enhance what they're doing already, to assess that on a sliding scale and to disseminate it through whatever means is going to breed that interest in mutual curiosity and exploration. And then we have Monti, which used to be called MYLO, which is our rules-based AI agent that does this too. So whereas most people use AI to ask it questions, Monti asks you questions entirely. That's all it does. And the reason to do so is to improve your noticing ability, your introspection, and your own kind of wise decision making. I'll just share a couple of recent studies. We provided method levels to a case series of people who reported having non-mainstream, potentially radicalized beliefs. And this was shown to be acceptable and distinctive and reported to, in those individuals, to have a key impact on their well-being and their preoccupation with their the distress caused by these beliefs. So method levels, a lot of literature as a therapy, but this gives one indication of how it can take the edge off some of this extreme and radicalized thought and words that we have discussed in the online arena. Discovery Talk, we did a trial at Curtin University, and again, it's shown to be really doable within 3 sessions. People say things like, it feels good to be able to help people, just to have some space for them to dismantle all their thoughts that is chaotic in their brain. It's a simple skill set, not an easy one to acquire because there's a lot of things, but it's also not specific to a certain type of context. It's just very open-ended. So people get this idea that it's something that we can do in the community. And we are busy developing Monti from MYLO. Our tagline, notice more, explore further, think wiser. This is our approach to try and scale up this way of approaching one's problems. Monti starts in your device, but its whole point is to turn your attention both inwards to your own needs and thoughts and feelings, and outwards from the device to the world around you, to nature and exercise and family and everything else that is important to people, in a way that's that's drawing on their autonomous decisions rather than telling them what to do. And we have research on what we think is the core process going on here, which I have alluded to. The idea that in our awareness we have a system that allows us to resolve conflicts, but it will only do its job if we direct it towards those uncomfortable, mixed, nagging feelings that you get when you have a problem and you can't make a decision. It has some resemblance with other concepts such as the conflict mindset, tolerance uncertainty, tolerance of conflict, and we've called it the discovery mode when we've trained discovery talk. And there's a measure which approximates to it called the reorganizational conflict scale, which we've had developed for a long period of time. Actually, that reference is from 2007. So example quotes: when I have a problem, I find myself listening to my thoughts to get a sense of perspective on them. I accept that sometimes I may not have the answer to things right now, and that is okay. So it's this report of having a sort of a working space in your own head to deal with conflicts. We did a study very recently of 800 participants, many of whom had, I think up to a third had mental health diagnoses, and we gave them quite a large battery of a wide range of different scales that are transdiagnostic, that tap into the processes that various researchers are interested in around these themes, including a range of symptom measures. And we found many things, but one key factor was that there was just one factor in this analysis that was adaptive. And all of the adaptive scales on all the different measures, even though they had different names, loaded on this factor. And the reorganisation of conflict scale correlated 0.72 with this factor, which indicates we are honing in on a core process of change. So I have an overview. I've tried to make the case to you, going right back, that human culture and technology is continuing in a way that it has done for thousands of years. We delegate control to automated systems. We engage in goal-directed action without awareness of the conflicts it causes, and sometimes without awareness of whether it meets our own needs. And that as a society, we implicitly enable giant virtual controllers in our world, in our culture, that get us stuck and also set up some of these challenging contexts of paradoxical collective control. We need to manage these factors, and it requires us to harness our own conscious awareness to attend to our unmet needs in the real world, and to detect and resolve goal conflicts through talking, sharing, and focusing for a long enough time so that we actually engage and learn from the experience. I've shared with you some key facilitators, or what we call catalysts. The access to alternatives, and some of these are very simple. Safe spaces in a working environment where people can talk in private about what's bothering them. Access to alternatives such as green spaces and nature, for example. These are all alternative environments which we know are healthy and take time away from the rabbit holes of device use. And that curious questioning, that stance that helps people to notice and to unpack what's going on for them, rather than feeding that curiosity with loads more information about things in the world that are not necessarily going to help one's own well-being and the well-being of one's community. Thank you very much.